All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jake Swanson, and I'm a program coordinator at the U.S. Energy Association on the Energy Utility Partnership Program based in Washington, D.C. Please note this webinar is being recorded and all participants are muted with their video turned off. You're welcome and encouraged to post questions either in the chat or the Q&A box below. I will be monitoring them and passing them on to our presenters as appropriate. Just to give a brief background on USEA, we're a nonprofit membership association of public and private energy related organizations, corporations, and government agencies. USEA represents the broad interests of the U.S. energy sector by increasing the understanding of energy issues both domestically and internationally through capacity building activities and events like this one. This series of webinars is financed through our cooperative agreement with USAID, the Energy Utility Partnership Program, and in particular with USAID's Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, E3 Bureau. This is the 10th webinar in our series on digitalization and cybersecurity. You can find recordings of past webinars on our website at usea.org/events. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll be able to see all the past events. Please join us in the coming weeks as we cover other areas of cybersecurity that are of importance to all of you working to strengthen the security and reliability of electric utilities. Next, Kristen Madler from the U.S. Agency for International Development will make some brief opening remarks.
Thanks, Jake. Welcome everyone to our webinar on power utility data protection policies and practices. I work in USAID's Global Energy Division. And in 2017, the Economist magazine said the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. So a new commodity spawns a lucrative, fast-growing industry, promoting antitrust regulators to step in to restrain those who control its flow. In the modern power sector, data means everything: reliable and affordable operations, satisfied customers, and economic growth. However, with unprotected data comes the potential for increased cyber vulnerabilities. So in today's webinar, our presenters will discuss the key component that enables these improvements, the data. And following this webinar series, USAID's Energy Division will launch a new global business innovation partnership program. The program will support utilities' ability to adapt to innovations in technology, increasing customer expectations, changing government oversight, and encourage new business models and business process improvements. And so today we welcome our speakers, Drew Bagley of CrowdStrike and Heng Mok of AGL Energy in Australia to our webinar. We especially thank Heng for connecting with us late in the evening, his time. We really appreciate you both carving out time to be here with us today and to share your unique perspectives. And we greatly appreciate your time and commitment. So with this brief overview, I will give the floor back to Jake to introduce today's panel.
Thank you, Kristen. Again, today's webinar is on power utility data protection policies and practices. Data protection is a critical aspect of compliance in many industries, including the energy sector. In fact, sensitive data is the most common target of cyber attacks. This webinar will address data protection considerations, best practices, and legal and regulatory frameworks in an era of smart grids and sophisticated cyber threats. Today we have the pleasure of having Drew Bagley, Vice President and Counsel for Privacy and Cyber Policy at CrowdStrike, which is one of the leading cybersecurity firms in the US. Drew is responsible for leading CrowdStrike's data protection initiatives, privacy strategy, and global policy engagement. He serves on the Europol Advisory Group on Internet Security and the US Department of State's International Digital Economy and Telecommunications Advisory Committee. Prior to joining CrowdStrike, Drew served in the Office of General Counsel at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He is a member of the New York State Bar and a former German Chancellor Fellow. Also presenting today is Heng Mok, the Chief Information Security Officer of AGL Energy, which is one of the largest utilities in Australia. Heng leads the cybersecurity team at AGL. His 20 years experience spans a range of industries and cybersecurity disciplines, including risk management, compliance, technical design, infrastructure security, and a whole host of other issues. Heng has worked on some of the largest transformation programs, including digital transformation in Australia within financial services and energy. He has written cybersecurity standards for the Open Data Center Alliance and sits on CompTIA cybersecurity committees. So with that, I will pass the floor over to Drew to share his screen and start the webinar. So thank you both for joining us. Drew, you're on mute.
Your presentation looks
Well,
great.
it wouldn't be a webinar without a technical difficulty, as I'm sure all of us are used to, and everyone watching as well. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Jake and Kristen, and thank you so much for everybody tuning in from around the globe. I'm sure some of you are tuning in similar to Heng from time zones that aren't as favorable, but really appreciate you being here. During these times, obviously, all of us have a lot to think about and worry about with regard to our responsibilities, especially for those of you working in the power utility sector. And so this webinar is intended to help you understand some of the data protection issues that you should be thinking about and that can help guide you to prevent any sort of data protection compliance issues or furthermore, even cybersecurity issues. But first and foremost, just want to acknowledge and thank everyone who's working hard to make sure that our grids across the world are running, especially during these uncertain times. So first of all, I'll discuss some of the data protection basics that are applicable regardless of industry, but especially in the power utility space. And then I'll talk about what type of data power utilities deal with that you might not even think about, or to the extent you think about it, you might not think about how it could be regulated differently than other sorts of data you may be dealing with and in charge of protecting. And then I'll move on to some of the threats we're seeing to data protection with regard to the energy sector and power utilities specifically. And then we'll let you have some insight into best practices that we see from our standpoint in the cybersecurity and data protection community before passing it along to Heng, who will be able to speak from a utility perspective. So first and foremost, even though data protection obviously has lots of acronyms and really can become quite a realm for jargon in any conversation, it really boils down to three fundamental principles with regard to data and what data responsibilities are. So the first of all is a responsibility by organizations responsible for data to protect the integrity of data. And so specifically, when you're talking about power utilities and the energy sector more broadly, it's really important to consider how reliable data is vital for providing reliable energy. Because if you have bad technical data, then that can obviously interfere with operations. And similarly, if the integrity of your data is not protected against manipulation with regard to pricing, that could also lead to disruption, or even the integrity of your data with regard to capacity and planning. And so virtually anything really requires that you're protecting the integrity of that data from any sort of manipulation. Similarly, even if you're successful at ensuring that your data stays accurate and timely, you could have an issue with availability. And that's why availability is another key component of data protection, because if you can't access the data and use the data, then the data is not going to be useful for its intended purpose. And so that's why making sure that your systems are running and that data is accessible is vital to data protection as well. And lastly, there's the principle of confidentiality. And so there's obviously some sort of data that either because of regulation or because of the nature of the data and what it means for you knowing it, but not for someone else knowing it, that you want to keep that data confidential. And especially when we're talking about power grids, there's a lot of data out there that could be especially useful for someone who has bad intent, and that should remain confidential from them and confidential from the greater public, but that should be accessible and available to a power utility, and that should be accurate for a power utility, of course. Oftentimes when we talk about data protection, privacy is mentioned, and privacy falls into this confidentiality bucket. However, data protection is holistic and involves these other two categories as well. And so along the lines of these three categories, and especially thinking about what you need to keep confidential, it's important to remember that data really is everywhere. Even if you think about your sector being specific to energy and being a power utility, it's important to remember that you have some of the same data that an organization in just about any industry would have as well, such as customer data or employee data or your basic IT infrastructure data. And then of course, there's specialized data with regard to power utilities, specific to data processed and needed for SCADA systems. And for those of you who have taken a step into the direction of smart grids, you can have all sorts of smart grid data flowing, as well as IoT sensors that have been deployed. And even simple sensors can generate a lot of data for which you are responsible. And then similarly, depending on the complexity and diversity of your business, there can be a lot of other confidential data that you can be responsible for. For example, you may have specific contracts that mandate the confidentiality of deals themselves, or of pricing with regard to supply, energy supply, or if you have special contracts for special projects, you can have a whole variety of things. And so that's why it's really important to remember that you can have a lot of confidential data for which you're responsible. Now, these responsibilities really boil down into three basic categories. There's the data subject, which are individuals, the data controller, which is the organization that's generally responsible for deciding what data is collected and how it's collected, and then the data processor, which in the context of a power utility could be a vendor you use, such as a vendor you might use for payroll, or a vendor you could use for parts of your IT infrastructure, like a cloud provider. And whereas the data subjects all the way on the left-hand side, that can be individuals that work for you, like employees. That could be individuals like customers paying bills to you, but that could even be individuals about whom you have data for other purposes. If, for example, you're getting personal data for purposes of allocating energy for a certain cause or for a certain initiative, you might inherit personal data from that as well. And then similarly, if you're getting a lot of technical data and smart grid data, you could potentially be getting personal data from more people than you would otherwise. So for example, if there are smart thermostats deployed as part of your energy program, then that's something where those could come with unique device identifiers and invariably come with some sort of data that might be tied back to an individual. And so it's really helpful to think about these three categories. These three categories, of course, use terms that are found in the European General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, but nonetheless, the concepts really are pretty universal throughout the globe now. So for example, in Brazil, where a recent law went into effect that's similar to GDPR, the LGPD, these three concepts by different names, again, follow the same principles. Similarly with CCPA, California's Consumer Privacy Act, these three concepts by different names are of course used. And so it's really important as you're thinking about your data protection planning, just to think about who the individuals are, who's the organization responsible for this data, and who's also touching the data and should be touching that data under instructions from the data controller or organization, in this case, the power utility. And these data protection obligations are everywhere. Just as data is everywhere, data protection obligations are everywhere too. So as I alluded to a moment ago, in addition to specific types of data that you may have in your possession about your employees and your customers and data that's subject to confidential agreements, there's subsets of that data and subsets of that data that are regulated a bit differently from one another and yet have many common obligations with regard to protecting the data. And so, for example, you could have a variety of contracts, of course, that have confidentiality provisions and just simple non-disclosure agreements. And you can have agreements flowing both ways with your customers as well as with your vendors. And there's also an important thing to think about with regard to nuanced data you could have, where you could have, of course, personal data, which depending on your country could have its own special regulations, or you could even have health data, such as for your employees, or if there's some sort of energy program in the health sector where you're providing some sort of energy to hospitals, for example, and part of that actually includes you getting some sort of data in return by way of a smart grid or by way of another means, then it's important to think about what sort of health data you could have that you could be responsible for. And similarly, financial data. You could have a lot of payment information, of course, from your customers and your suppliers, but you could even have financial data, again, if there's some sort of customer in the financial sector and as part of some sort of program, you're getting some sort of data. And so it's important to think about that. And then similarly, if you're working with any government entities, it's important to consider whether or not you may have some sort of national security data in your possession that could be subject to some sort of classification requirements or other confidentiality provisions. And the bottom line is that you, regardless of which types of data you have with regard to other individuals, naturally running a power grid, you're going to have proprietary data in your possession that you would not like to be out there. And so power grid data, of course, can include your proprietary data about the grid itself and the design of the grid, or about which technologies you've implemented, or even your supply chain and how you get your power and how you do your power distribution, how you do your power supply. And so it's important to think about that holistically and think about what is actually valuable to you, because that's the key thing to think about with data protection, is assigning value to data. And more sensitive data is going to be more valuable in many ways because it's going to come with more protections, but also there's going to be data that might not be as sensitive under regulations, but nonetheless is valuable to someone else and valuable to a potential adversary. And so that's why it's important to think about how to protect that data and comply with data protection requirements. And similarly, these requirements can include a variety of things depending on the laws in your country, but these can of course include just basics like keeping a register of all of your processing activities and how you're touching data and using data. And similarly, making sure that you're keeping that data integrity intact, keeping it available and keeping it confidential, even for purposes beyond the purposes for which you run your business, but purposes like for potential litigation. In case there's ever any sort of legal situation, you need to make sure that you know where the data is and can access it. And so that's another component that goes into holistic data protection. But underlying all of this is a key requirement for cybersecurity. Because around the globe, even though there aren't a lot of cybersecurity specific regulations, there are a lot of regulations that touch on personal information or personal data and provide some sort of holistic data protection requirement to protect data against threats, such as cyber threats. And so that's where cybersecurity is increasingly key to data protection, especially if we look at some more modern laws in this realm, such as the European Union's GDPR, which imposes an obligation to implement security appropriate to the risk. So that's a principles-based requirement, because as risk evolves, then what's appropriate will naturally evolve. Similarly, the California Consumer Privacy Act requires that organizations implement reasonable security. And again, a definition of what's reasonable is going to continue to evolve as cybersecurity threats evolve. And then the Australian privacy principles also require reasonable steps to be taken to protect data. And so again, these principles-based approaches mean that organizations have to be thoughtful, not just about how they could have protected yesterday's known threat or known data breach, but how can they actually think about what's reasonable today or appropriate today against the risks of today. So you need to think about all of that data that's in your possession, how it could all be regulated differently, but nonetheless, how a lot of those regulations are going to have similar requirements about reasonableness and appropriateness when it comes to security. And there's also sector-specific regulations with regard to cybersecurity. While cybersecurity regulations as standalone regulations aren't yet common across the globe, cybersecurity controls being implemented into critical infrastructure regulations are becoming increasingly common. And so, for example, a couple years ago, Saudi Arabia released the Essential Cybersecurity Controls of 2018, which implemented a variety of cybersecurity controls that are specific to operators of critical infrastructure, including power utility operators. Similarly, several years ago, the European Union implemented the NIS directive, the Network and Information Systems Directive, which actually goes well beyond power utilities, but includes power utilities and includes other aspects of digital infrastructure as well that are part and parcel of the digital economy. And so what these require as well is that European Union member states impose cybersecurity requirements on those operators of critical infrastructure, including power utilities. And recently, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation released critical infrastructure protection cybersecurity reliability standards. And these also impose obligations on utility providers in North America so that they're meeting modern cybersecurity requirements. And so it's important to think about how protecting data, considering what's in your data universe in your own organization, and making sure that you have reasonable or appropriate controls in place can be something that's required by various regulations, and that if done right can actually help you increase your compliance with various regulations, both specific to power utilities and those specific to different data types themselves. Another global trend is that breach notification requirements are now increasingly common throughout the globe. So, for example, many of these began as sector-specific requirements focused especially on health data or financial data, but increasingly are getting broader to just covering personal data. And so it's important to think about how your organization has a plan with regard to first protecting data to begin with, so that you're complying with those requirements under the law. And second, thinking about what you would do if there was some sort of data breach and you had a reporting requirement, because those reporting requirements, depending on where you're located, can actually vary greatly. Some of them are as little as 72 hours to report to a regulator, and sometimes, depending on the severity of a data breach and the potential impact to rights and liberties of individuals, can even mean reporting relatively quickly to individuals themselves. And then there's others that give you up to 60 days or 30 days to report some sort of a data breach. But nonetheless, the commonality with these data breach notification requirements around the globe is that there's generally some sort of impact trigger, meaning that any sort of security alert is not an incident in and of itself, a reportable incident. Instead, you really have to have some sort of data breach that actually triggers the requirements of the law, and those generally are triggered by there being a potential impact to individuals that would actually affect individuals, and it would actually affect their rights. So for example, if there's some sort of potential for identity theft, or in the context of a power utility, if you think about some sort of credential theft, where there could be a potential impact because those stolen credentials could actually be used to perpetrate harm on an energy grid and actually displace energy for thousands or millions of individuals, then that's something that is likely going to be reportable under the law because of the severity of that potential impact. And so it's important to think about what type of data in your possession could have that impact, how that data is being protected with reasonable and appropriate measures, and then how you would be able to investigate and successfully and quickly report if something happened, so that you would be able to make sure that those who need to know right away and can take appropriate steps for mitigation. So, as I noted, cybersecurity, of course, is a key part of data protection. And so it's important to understand what the cyber threats are that are specific to the power utility threatscape today. And what we see at CrowdStrike is we see a variety of actors, and I'll get into the different types of actors in a moment, but we see a variety of actors using many different tactics and techniques in attempts to perpetrate power grids around the globe. And their aims can vary depending on the type of actor. But some of the most common things we see these days is that we see credential harvesting, as I alluded to a moment ago, whereby adversaries are attempting to steal credentials from those who have access to sensitive information related to power utilities and the energy sector as a whole. Because once you steal credentials, then you can move laterally throughout an organization's environment and get to even more valuable data, such as that is behind running the power grid itself, or just to be able to get use credentials to do more nefarious actions and more destructive actions against the IT infrastructure of power utilities. Similarly, we see adversaries using cyber attacks to engage in espionage so that they can monitor power utilities and determine who their suppliers are and map out the supply chain and find out what pricing data looks like and find out what decisions are being made and find out even when various employees are logging on and logging off and get a true understanding of how a specific power utility is run. We also see, of course, firmware corruption for the devices that are vital to the power grid. And so this is a technique whereby adversaries are able to perhaps use credential harvesting, a phishing attack, or some other sort of means to get onto a computer and then can tunnel their way to the system that they want to manipulate and actually affect the integrity of the firmware itself by replacing the proprietary firmware with firmware that actually has some sort of code in it that is helpful for the adversary's key objective. And of course, we see data destruction, whereby adversaries are using various techniques like ransomware or just straight up wiping hard drives in order to, again, strike back at that data availability principle we talked about with regard to data protection. And we similarly, related to this, we see the inhibiting of system recovery. So whereby when a system is actually attacked, of course, if you have reliable backups, then you might be able to get you might still have your data integrity and be able to get your data availability back up and running again. But we see adversaries finding ways to inhibit system recovery. And then, of course, ransomware, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, can sometimes be used for data destruction if files are never decrypted, and then other times are used, of course, to extract money from power utilities, and oftentimes, of course, these can be run by the government. And so this is a trend we see with a lot of government entities, including school districts and city halls, and we see this with regard to power grids or power utilities as well. And so who are these adversaries, you may be asking? Well, the adversaries are not a homogeneous group. Instead, it really depends on the type of adversary you're dealing with as to what the motivations may be and what the techniques may be, as well as the sophistication and resources behind them. And so one key adversary interested in power grids are nation states. And nation states are, of course, motivated by international events and geopolitics that are driving an overall strategy. And part of that strategy may be first conducting some sort of espionage against power grids so that they're ready with a plan in case they need to use that. Other times, it could be that power grids are actually being targeted by nation states for purposes where they're ready to actually weaponize information they've collected and actually disrupt electricity. And similarly, there's other times where there is a, there's a competitive purpose whereby a nation state might be attempting to get into a new market with regard to sending its energy there and selling its energy in the market. It might want competitive intelligence, and similarly might want to manipulate data in a way to have a competitive edge with regard to ensuring that its country and its power suppliers get the contracts instead of another. And then, of course, there are power utilities that are part and parcel of public companies and may have public stock market stocks tied to them. And so sometimes nation states are actually engaged in some form of stock manipulation, or just another form of even just stealing intellectual property for their own innovation and their own purposes. And so there's a variety of means why nation states can target power utilities and target the specific employees that work for power utilities because of the access to information that they could have. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Then there are e-crime actors, and e-crime actors have become increasingly sophisticated in recent years, sometimes using the same techniques and tactics as nation state actors, whereby I think many years ago, the caricature that people had in their heads for an e-crime actor would have been someone in a hoodie in their basement and someone relatively young. And instead, it's important to always remember that crime pays. And so it's no different with regard to e-crime actors, because crime absolutely does pay. And so that's why there's a motivation for financial gain here with e-crime actors. And there's cross-sector targeting too of small and large enterprises to get a hold of their financial information and their bank accounts. Many of you have probably heard of business email compromise, whereby executives with organizations are targeted with phishing emails that look like they're coming from internally from the accounting department, where the adversaries use such sophisticated social engineering that they actually write in the same style and use the same terms as someone internal to the organization. And so that's where it's really important to consider that this could be used against a power utility as well, whereby your own organization could receive some sort of phishing email that looks like it's coming from the regulator, coming from a supplier, a vendor, or someone internally asking you for some sort of financial details that you're used to supplying to that individual, and yet it might not be that individual. And so that's why it's important to think about that. And so e-crime actors are notorious for going after money wherever they can find it. And similarly, they use a common tool called RATs, or remote access tools. And so remote access tools provide e-crime actors a means to first conduct some sort of surveillance to ensure that they can get their social engineering right and read legitimate emails and see which person in an organization talks to another person, and really understand the entire hierarchy of an organization and map it out in a sophisticated way before going on to go after the money itself. And similarly, e-crime actors can even use data they're finding, such as that from a power utility, and especially if you think about the data you might have on power consumption for your customers, to know when somebody's home or somebody's on vacation. Because of course, there are trends that even police have used to crack cases in countries around the globe with regard to power consumption data. So think about that and how a sophisticated e-crime actor could use that too to commit real world physical crimes against a residence or against a business if they know that the power consumption is down. And so that's why it's important to think about that as well. Then lastly, there are hacktivists. And hacktivists really are a bit of a catch-all category because the motivation can vary and hacktivists are driven by a specific cause or movement. And you could even throw a variety of actors into this category of hacktivists, ranging from relatively benign actors all the way to terrorists who might use hacktivist-like tactics in order to commit a non-nation state and non-e-crime style attack. And so the common motivation here for hacktivists is, of course, that they're focused on some sort of impact that's usually tailored around disruption, embarrassment, or destruction, rather than focusing, for example, on money like an e-crime actor would. And so their tactics can actually be relatively simple. And if you think about it, power utilities, especially those that are government entities, can really face the same tactics and techniques that sophisticated government organizations face day in and day out, even when an adversary is not able to get into their core system or get their core data, where they're able to do certain things like web defacement or DDoS attacks. And so, or doxing of individuals. And so that's why it's really important to think about that with regard to power utilities and ensure that you and your organization and those who are tied to your organization aren't targets for that. Oftentimes, there might be indications or warnings for other adversaries with regard to geopolitical events or with regard to suspicious behavior that you're seeing from cybercrime groups. However, with hacktivism, it can sometimes occur, with a moment's notice, anywhere, anytime. And so that's again where, if you're paying attention to those cybersecurity requirements for data protection, you're going to be able to prepare yourself for a variety of things, including those tied to hacktivism. And that's why it's important to just always assume that you're a target. And remember that what you being a target can mean your organization being a target, but it can also mean you individually being a target from a social engineering standpoint. And so if you think about your data protection obligations and maintaining the integrity, the availability, and the confidentiality of data in your possession, then think about who else would find that data valuable. And think about where all of that data is. It's really important for basic data protection hygiene to understand your data inventory and your data flows, where that data is going and where it should be going versus where that data may be going that it shouldn't be going. And think about which data in your possession is actually specifically regulated or is otherwise sensitive, such as the proprietary grid data that you may be responsible for. And think about your holistic supply chain and how valuable that data could be to the wrong person. And think about whether or not you understand your full supply chain. You might be able to think about a vendor that has access to some data, but do you know who that vendor further uses that can access their data? And do you know where your data really is ending up and which countries it's flowing to and which other actors may be able to see that data, access that data, and how they might be able to use that data for purposes that you did not intend when you gave it to your initial vendor. So think about your supply chain holistically. And then also ask yourself whether or not you actually have appropriate technical and organizational safeguards in place. Because remember, data protection is about cybersecurity, but it's also about having the right organizational measures in place. So think about how you would respond to some sort of data incident and who would be helping you respond. not just from a technical standpoint, but also organizationally. Who would be communicating to key stakeholders? Who would be helping you assess any sort of legal risk? Consider whether or not you have outside counsel to work with so that you can work under privilege if you have an incident. And consider which vendors you have and which technologies you are implementing from a cybersecurity standpoint to ensure that you're protecting data, but also having a trusted partner who can help you interpret data in the event that there is an incident. And so putting this all together, it's really important to assume you're a target and think about how best to protect yourself. And that's why it's vital to stay vigilant, because staying vigilant is the only way to comply with cybersecurity obligations these days and fundamentally data protection obligations, because a holistic approach to data protection requires vigilance and the following of common data protection frameworks. So I mentioned GDPR, of course, earlier, and while there are a multitude of personal information or personal data laws around the globe, GDPR provides some fundamental principles that tend to be universal. And those are the key for those with data protection compliance is transparency about what you're processing, when you're processing it, how you're processing it, who you're giving it to, why you're processing it, how long you're holding it, and that fundamental data protection hygiene. Purpose limitation, ensuring you're only using data in your possession for the purpose for which it was given to you. So think about that with regard to your customer data as a power utility, or think about that with regard to some of that newer smart grid data you could be receiving. And then similarly, of course, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity of the data, and confidentiality, as we've discussed. So it's important to think about all of that and to scrutinize, of course, not only the vendors, as I discussed a moment ago, but even scrutinize the software you're using and the source of the app developers and what sort of telemetry data could be flowing from your IT networks to your software developers and your app developers that you might not think about. And think about the legitimacy of any sort of software you might be using before connecting, and how mature that developer is if you're talking about implementing some sort of new smart grid technology and using some sort of new app developer you haven't used in the past. And then, of course, follow basic security hygiene, like two-factor authentication, ensuring you're deploying some sort of endpoint security protection that actually evolves in real time, so that you're ensuring that you're meeting those evolving standards of appropriateness and reasonableness that are risk-based, rather than merely using something that's signature-based and only as good as yesterday. Think about how your IoT and smart grids, while you might not think that the data processed by them is interesting in and of itself, think about what security measures are actually in place for those, because an IoT device, even if the sensor itself isn't that interesting, it might be that that sensor could be used for an adversary to access in order to then move to connected IT infrastructure to find more interesting information and move laterally. Or if you have a lot of IoT sensors, those might be interesting and useful for some sort of adversary targeting power grids to be used as botnets even, or for some sort of greater longer term espionage or destruction of infrastructure. So it's important to think about that as well. And then to consider that even if you are meeting certain ICS certification, or you're deploying certain ICS certified technologies, you might not actually be meeting the actual risks of the day. So it's important to look at those certifications and consider whether or not they're actually in line with what risks look like today. In other words, merely being compliant might not be good enough to truly protect your data and adhere to data protection. And so that's why it's important to think about how there's ICS certified antivirus technologies today that don't even require updates, that you can't even update because they're in the firmware of a device. And that might not mean that your organization's actually prepared and ready against today's threats, especially where adversaries are able to use techniques to breach data and violate data protection without ever even using malware. Many of the attacks today actually are malware-less and don't use malware, and therefore would not be detected by some sort of traditional AV approach. And so that's why it's important to think about that as well. And so with all of those things, it's really important to stay vigilant and remember that fundamentally data protection is holistic. And so with that, I thank you. And I know that you're going to learn a lot from Heng, who's going to be able to present from a data utility, or rather from a power utility perspective, but from a, from a fundamental holistic data protection perspective as well.
Thank you so much, Drew. Your perspective is very appreciated, because I think a lot of us in the audience don't have the legal background that you do. And you covered so much, from proprietary information to NDAs to the different case studies in different countries about data protection. And I think your presentation specifically is very relevant to some of our webinars going forward. Actually, our next one, next Thursday, is on supply chain security. And we have our 15th one on what to do before, after, and during cybersecurity attacks. So thank you so much, Drew. And I will pass the floor over to Heng now.
Thank you, Jake.
Heng, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
I'm just
perfect.
setting up at the moment. All right. Let's have a look. All right. Can everyone see that on the screen?
Yep.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming to this this webinar. My name is Heng Mok. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at AGL Energy. And basically today what I wanted to do was highlight a campaign that we have done internally within our organization that talks a little bit about data protection and essentially the way that we approach it from a human perspective. So today I'm just going to cover off these particular 4 points. So I'll talk a little bit about who AGL Energy is in the marketplace and what we do, so that you have a little bit of a context around the organization itself. I'll then move on and talk a little bit about the energy industry as a whole and some of the trends which are sort of driving the need to protect our data better. And then I'll talk a little bit about a raindrop campaign, which is our way of contextualizing how we protect information within our organization and how everyone can play a part in being able to do that. And then lastly, we'll follow up with any questions that you may have. So just a little bit about AGL itself. So AGL is one of Australia's largest energy providers. And we're essentially a essential service. So being a large provider, we believe that we can make the biggest change. And, culturally that goes to the fact that, during the shifting market in the energy space, we've transitioned and we've always tried to keep ahead and look at the forward view of where things are going within our industry. So as an integrated essential service provider, we basically provide different services to our customers. We provide both gas, electricity, and telecommunication services. And we see really that both data and energy are at a cross point, and they both form an essential service. And as a result of that, we see that there is a lot of interesting ability for us to place into the customer those types of services. So we, on our customer side and retail side, we deliver these services to residential, small and large businesses, as well as some of the larger wholesale customers across Australia. In terms of, our generation portfolio, we generate about 20% of the generation capability within Australia's national electricity market. So that's a mix of different generation capability. We have thermal coal, both brown and black coal, large generation capability, which is centralized. We have renewables capability, which is wind, solar, and we also are looking at sort of other capabilities around battery, peaking plants, gas generation as well. So in terms of the variety of the assets that we manage, they're fairly diverse, and they form both centralized, which is some of the assets I've talked about, but also decentralized. So things like our virtual power plant, where we're utilizing both batteries and storage and orchestrating those assets from a distributed nature perspective. So in terms of where we have our priorities, we have three priorities. It's all about growth, transformation, and social license. So that just gives you a little bit of an overview of the organization itself, some of the assets, and sort of forms a picture of the types of things that we deal with from an energy perspective across both retail and generation. So if we sort of move in and have a bit of a look at the energy market itself, you know, it's essentially evolving and it's transforming. You know, in the context of I guess, you know, every sort of energy market in the world, they're all slightly different. The ownership could be different between your transmission providers compared to your retail and to your generation. You may have regulation that forbids certain parts of that market being owned by a single entity around that life cycle. And hence, you know, the complexity around that means that, you know, the connectivity between those three components within the energy market are there. And the threats and the connectivity means that you just need to be aware of the interplay between those components in the market. I guess the other thing to really consider is that, you know, overall, the energy market itself is also transitioning. So, you know, historically where we saw a lot of assets which were centralized, we're now starting to see the uptick of, you know, renewables, which has then generated a market that requires both storage capability and firming capability, because your base load generation is not able to deal with, or I guess your renewable and your less, I guess, base load type capabilities are moving towards these parts which are relying more on renewable energy, and hence, you know, that sort of complements the need to have those other emerging technologies. I think the things around electric vehicles and the fact that an electric vehicle potentially in the future would be used as a storage device in the home is also another sort of interesting transition away from, I guess, centralized assets. The other part of it is that really across the board, we're starting to see a lot more compliance and cybersecurity regulation come into place, and largely that's around critical infrastructure and essential services. So recently in Australia, the Australian government has highlighted as part of its cybersecurity strategy that it's looking at legislating and regulating in the critical infrastructure space, which will then drive minimum security requirements that are required by all parties that are managing systems of national significance. And you know, if you look at the energy grid itself, it's going to form part of that I guess ecosystem as being critical infrastructure and an essential service within every nation's capability. And then if we think about I guess the growth of things like IoT sensors that are driving some of the decision making that the businesses are doing in this space. So, you know, whether that's a smart sensor in the home that is looking at, you know, hungry generating devices in order to make a decision on whether to sort of you know, take the demand down of those types of devices, all the way through to things like predictive maintenance. So being able to identify within your plant or your site how efficient it's running, and then being able to drive better decision-making processes from that information. And then I think the last part really is that with the digitization of the plants, of the sensors itself, and the concept of the power plant of the future, as well as, I guess, the distributed energy piece, then you have a much larger relationship with third parties. and with cloud providers. So I guess with the, traditionally where you've seen these large generation plants being generated, the technology was homogeneous, it was unique. I guess with the introduction and digitization now of a lot of the plant and assets itself and the management of those assets, what we're starting to see is that with digitization, there is a lot more commoditization of technology, which as a result of that means that threat surface also increases, because you're not dealing with unique type technology anymore. You're dealing with very sort of commodity based capability. So I guess contextualizing data protection and awareness strategies. So, what we see in our organization is that, data and information protection is definitely a shared responsibility for all parties within our organization. Everyone handles data. Data is everywhere. And as a result of that, it's really important to enable that awareness and that messaging and that thinking of being able to leverage your staff, your suppliers, as the first line of defense, right? So they're handling the data. It's important that they're aware of their responsibilities. They're sort of also aware of the types of information and data that they're handling. And I guess, being able to contextualize what that means for them from an energy perspective. So one of the things that we've actually done is we've driven a campaign, and we call the campaign the Raindrop Campaign. And this was based on, I guess, some of the 5 No's of cybersecurity that another Australian organization developed, Telstra, back in 2015. And what we've done is we've contextualized that for the energy industry and for, I guess, the people within our organization. So they're able to relate to some of the concepts of data protection and able to bring that into how they manage and protect data within the organization. So this is really part of what I would call our cyber awareness delivery. So, we have a strong belief that it's important that everyone plays a part in being able to manage cyber across the organization. While we have a central team, it's really important that everyone plays a part in being able to manage and handle and be aware of their responsibility with regards to cybersecurity. So we believe that as part of the culture, as part of the organization's DNA, it's really important to build cyber advocates across the organization. And part of that is that, when you think about a raindrop, we think of a raindrop as a piece of information. And what we're able to do is we're able to drive home a message with our staff that, because we have a lot of hydro-based power as well, generation plants, they're able to relate to the fact that renewable energy relates to raindrops, which means that, protecting that information and looking at the potential of a raindrop and where it can, add a whole lot of value and become something bigger is something that they're able to relate to. So what I might do now is just talk a little bit about the Raindrop campaign itself. So the Raindrop campaign is essentially, we're talking about our information, and we're talking about how precious our information is. So every piece of information to us is like a raindrop. It's precious. So in terms of being able to message that within the organization itself, we talk about it in the sense of essentially that we need to define what's special about every raindrop, or about what of every piece of information that we have within the organization. And what that does is it by describing that information, by labeling it, we're able to then identify whether it's customer information that is potentially used within a contact center scenario that may be used to validate the identity of a customer, all the way through to potentially plant schematics, which are used by engineers to work out what the maintenance schedule may be required at the plant. So being able to drive home the concept of a raindrop and it's a piece of information, and defining how special it is, and recognizing as well, that particular information or that data, would it be valuable to a third party? Would it be valuable to a competitor? Would it be valuable to a nation state? So driving that message and recognizing that, that there are some raindrops which are going to be more important, and then some raindrops which are going to be less important in the context of that type of information. I guess that also then leads into the discussion about, driving responsibilities around classifying information within your organization. So being able to label both structured and unstructured data, understanding the life cycle where that information goes. And then that essentially allows you to drive home, I guess, the messaging and reinforce the message of knowing where, knowing that type of information and where it is. I guess then that leans into the second point about the fact that the information is like a raindrop. It can land anywhere and fall anywhere and be used by anyone. So, if you think about information and you think about third parties, you think about digitization, the information like a raindrop can flow into different parts of the organization, into different areas, and hence, that part of it is all about understanding then, with that information going into all these disparate places, who actually has access to that information, and is there certain information which may be regulated or require special types of access? So it drives home a message around potentially that from a privileged access perspective around some of this data, it's really important to potentially apply extra controls there. You think about, I guess, the PCI space, and you think about credit card data. That's obviously has a context around it, and it needs to be protected in a certain way. So I guess what this is doing is driving the next level of message around, regulating the access to that data, making sure that the vendors and partners that you have that may be performing functions for you have the appropriate access to that information, as well as then leveraging and making sure that the right processes are in place to determine who has access to that information. And then I guess we talk about, we must carefully protect, carefully collect and safely store our raindrops. So this is all about, safely storing our information as we collect it, but also as we use it. So we know that, from a potential perspective, raindrops can become something much larger, especially when they collect together. They can form a large lake. They can, form into a river. They can have a whole lot of potential and be able to move to different places as well. So, some of the thoughts around that is that, where are the raindrops stored? Are they stored in a secure dam? So, they're in a air-gapped network, they're protected, only the right people have access to that, or, are they in a cloud storage, which, potentially with the digitization of things, you have to consider that open storage blob could potentially be used by anyone, and it's open on the internet, and we've seen a number of breaches by other organizations where a simple thing around a unauthenticated storage account could lead to data compromise. So then I guess the other part of that is also, understanding who are the third parties that are storing the raindrops on our behalf. So, we may leverage a third party that provides maintenance on a plant. They require certain types of information in order to operate that environment. So just understanding, you know, where those raindrops have gone and who is actually collecting and storing them on your behalf becomes really important. And then I guess the other part of that is, you know, what are the processes that are in place to transfer those raindrops around the organization? So, you know, data needs to move between systems, it needs to move between third parties as that information is sort of analyzed, as it's sort of the value is generated from that information. It potentially may move, be transformed, and fall into multiple parts. So just understanding those processes that are in place to protect those raindrops as they flow down the river and move across the organization and between organizations. And then the next point is really around, you know, the raindrops must be protected and managed by our people. So this is all about, you know, understanding how well that information may be protected, and you know, who are the people that are protecting them. And, you know, simple basic things. Can we contact them? Are they easily contactable? Do we know who the data stewards are within the organization that are responsible for approving the use of that information? So this falls into the whole governance and being able to ensure that that information is being protected at all the stages of its life cycle. And then the last point is really about to maximize the potential. So every raindrop or every piece of information has the potential to become something bigger. So, you know, we think about, you know, the value that gets generated out of the information. You know, you may at some point be consolidating information in warehouses. You may be consolidating utilization information from the plants to see what the efficiencies are and whether you can perform predictive maintenance in order to make sure that you're doing the right maintenance before something breaks. So it's always important to know the value of that information as it comes together and as it's mined. So I guess in terms of how we reinforce that message, we use the 5 R's. So to reinforce that message, we talk about and we call out that the fact that, you know, it's really important to recognize how precious the raindrops are. You need to know and regulate how and who has access to it. You need to be responsible as well and safely collect, store, and use it wisely. You need to respect and protect the information and then realize its potential. So this is a way that we reinforce that message across the organization around how important it is to protect data. And then the last part that we go into is some of the, I guess, terms or some of the slogans that we apply within the organization. And this really reinforces to the people that are working within the organization how to handle your data. The one that I'll call out is don't be a wally with our information. So a wally is someone that doesn't respect the information or doesn't look after the information. That's an Australian term, but essentially that's what that particular slogan or term means. So, you know, being able to relate to the fact that you know, for checking for leaks in the system. So, you know, understanding that if the data is moving into the wrong hands or moving into the wrong systems, you know, even from a device perspective, as you sort of interact and utilize information on your devices, is there any of that information leaking out via a data exfiltration mechanism, via a USB, via a unsanctioned cloud storage? So it's important to reinforce those types of messages. You know, who's drinking our information? Which third parties have access to that information? You know, don't waste a drop. So always utilize the information that you need, and you're not wasting, and you're not you know, gathering more than you require. You know, don't flush away the information. So always know how, where you're putting it and how you're managing it, and recognize as well that the information is a precious gift, and it's important to protect it and respect it. So I guess on that note, I just wanted to share that campaign with everyone, and some of the things that we've done to I guess, educate, to make our staff more aware, and to simplify the message of data protection. So it's, you know, sometimes I think that we can think about all the regulatory requirements and we sort of form this complex picture in our heads. I guess this is one mechanism and one way that you can contextualize that in the sense of it being energy specific, and then being able to relay that message back to your staff to reinforce the importance of protecting the data that your organization uses on a day-to-day basis. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Jake if there's any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hang, for your analogies with the water and raindrops. And I think, you know, my first question is, obviously you don't want any Wallies in your organization, you know, mishandling your data. And actually during this webinar, we actually got an email for our cybersecurity staff training that we do. And I think that's, you mentioned, it's a key area to protect data in energy organizations. Can you kind of emphasize how important this is, and do you have any recommendations on what should be focused on during this training?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you know, as part of the training, what we do is we ensure that, you know, people understand the policies and the requirements that they have with regards to handling the data. But what we also do is we try to come down to the level of making it relatable. And this is one way that we're able to do it, by utilizing a theme or a campaign. And essentially helping them understand in basic terms, okay, well, what's the implications of some of these things? So, for example, if your data leaks out, well, you know, the implications of that is that there's potentially, you know, regulatory issues that may come out of that. So, I guess, you know, for us, this is really a theme and a way that we can bring anyone from our contact center staff all the way through to our engineers on understanding, you know, the basics of cybersecurity and what it is, and some of the responsibilities that they have with regards to handling information and sensitive information, and sort of, you know, thought-provoking them around that as well. So essentially, it's to drive that message consistently, and it's something that they can remember as well.
Excellent. Drew, do you have any comments on that question about the importance of training staff?
Yeah, I think it's important to have a regular cadence of training, obviously, and then to make sure you're updating it with something that's contextual and specific to what your organization might be dealing with as it evolves, or what might be actually trending in the real world with regard to cybersecurity attacks. And so that's something that, you know, even internally at CrowdStrike, when I put together training for our employees, something I do is, of course, I always regularly update the training with whatever the newest regulations are that could be applicable, but then also try and tie in some real world examples, even if they come from headlines where we've read about, you know, an organization that an employee, you know, mishandled data in some sort of way. I always want to make sure I'm driving that lesson home. So I would just echo a lot of what Heng said, where you have to, you know, in training, you really have to get your employees to understand this isn't some sort of far off concept, and to think about it, you know, through analogies in a way that they can really relate to.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think this year in particular, you know, this series is so timely because 2020 is kind of the year of increased ransom attacks. Do you have any advice on how utilities can kind of respond to them?
Sure. You know, I think a lot of the basics with ransomware tie back these days to what is actually appropriate or reasonable with regard to cybersecurity safeguards that are required for data protection. So first and foremost, if you think about the integrity, availability, and confidentiality, it's important to have good backups, of course, and to make sure that you are doing your backups on a regular cadence so that you could recover information if you were hit with ransomware. But then fundamentally, to prevent ransomware to begin with, it's important to ensure that power utilities are deploying technologies that are actually evolving in real time. So endpoint protection that evolves in real time, and that gives you some sort of organizational-wide holistic view. Because what you're protecting is your organization as a whole, not just some individual computer, especially when it comes to ransomware in the modern sense, where it can spread like a traditional worm could spread from computer to computer and move laterally. And so that's where you really need some sort of endpoint detection that can look at some sort of indicator of attack, realize, wait a minute, this behavior and what's going on with these files, this file manipulation, this encryption running, I'm going to stop this right away. This doesn't look right. I might not know what this bad file is specifically. I may have never seen this bad file before, but the behavior on the system looks suspicious. I'm going to stop it. Or why is this computer all of a sudden, running PowerShell commands to encrypt another computer? That doesn't look right. And so it's deploying technologies like that, and then ensuring that you have an organization-wide view and can really measure yourself with metrics. At CrowdStrike, something we advocate for is the 1-10-60 rule, where you should be able to detect an incident within 1 minute, contain it within 10 minutes, or investigate it rather within 10 minutes, and then contain it within 60 minutes. And so by doing that, what you're going to do is you're going to make sure that you're measuring yourself and setting yourself up for success by measuring yourself to these metrics, even if you're not hitting them right away. And that's the sort of thing you need for something rapid moving like ransomware.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would also I'd also add just with regards to ransomware and the evolving of that, making sure that you run relevant exercises that would both test your controls against that type of attack, but also your organizational processes, right? So, in the scenario that your organization was or did come under a ransomware attack, how would you communicate that within the organization? What would your response be? Where, at what point would you bring in your cyber insurers potentially, right? And testing that end-to-end process, because essentially you're going to have different levels of staff and management involved in responding to that type of large-scale incident. So being able to build up the muscle memory and being able to respond and work through and make sure that the organization is geared and understands its responsibilities on how to respond to that type of incident is really important.
Absolutely. And I think that should definitely be emphasized as well, is that, it's cybersecurity, data protection is not just a one-off training that you can do one time and train your employees and say, okay, we don't have any more risk because we took this training, might have been a couple of years ago even, but having the constant reminders to be vigilant, I think is very important. I do want to let our audience know that we will be sending a recording of the webinar as well as the presentations after the webinar. We did have a question from the audience. What is the percentage of avoiding a cyber attack, even if you're complying to the relevant best practices and regulations? Or I guess, how less likely are you to get a ransomware or cyber attack by complying with best practices and regulations?
I would say that it really depends on how you're interpreting those best practices, because again, the standards these days for data protection laws and for even some of those cybersecurity controls I went over include these words like appropriate or reasonable. And so a regulator might not know today what's appropriate or reasonable for a risk until they see the data breach. And then that's when an organization is going to learn whether or not their measures truly were appropriate or reasonable and therefore meeting that criteria. So instead, I think the lesson to take away is that to ultimately meet those obligations, you have to focus on what risk looks like today and look at what cyber attacks actually look like, what techniques are being used and whatnot. Earlier this year, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, which is their regulator for data protection and their regulator under GDPR, issued a £500,000 fine against an organization because they didn't have appropriate cybersecurity controls in place. And the standard they used there was that the organization didn't make it as difficult as possible for the adversary to infiltrate the organization's systems. And so I think that is indicative of the fact that the bar is being raised. So it's no longer checkbox compliance. Instead, it's really about paying attention to the real world risks and figuring out how you're going to handle them. And to Heng's point, doing those tabletop exercises and red teaming. I think that's the only way you really figure out if you truly would be compliant if you were faced with any sort of potential data breach.
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is that you know, just in terms of the processes now in place, you know, protection controls, you know, are never going to be 100% now. You know, what we're sort of seeing is that you're always going to have incursions in your organization, and it's basically how you detect and respond to that. And it's almost setting that mindset that that it's shifted now, right? So the rate of change, the rate of advancement in the cyberspace, both from a threat and adversary perspective, has increased to the point where I think it's pretty much at some point some of your controls will fail, and it's how you detect, respond, and recover as a result of that. And it's just having that mindset now that that is the world that we are in.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to ask one final question, and then I'll let you both go because we are a little bit over time. So what's the likelihood of utilities that are in the process of making their networks smarter, that they're open to third parties, and how do they minimize third-party risks?
I think Heng will probably have a lot of perspective on this, dealing with this firsthand, but I would just say as some general rules that are applicable from a data protection standpoint is it's really important to embrace new technologies when those new technologies are actually solving a problem for you, versus embracing new technologies for new technology's sake. In essence, you know, if you're going to go the smart grid route, you have to think about, you know, what the benefits are, what the value is, why you're doing it, and then fundamentally make sure that you actually are using reliable partners for it and understand the entire supply chain and where all of the data is going. Because it's not this notion that, you know, data shouldn't ever leave the organization. Sometimes data is actually intended to leave the organization, of course. But if you don't know where it's going or how it's being used, and you don't have accountability in your contracts and with your technical controls, then that's where the real risk lies. So I'd say I just caution against you know, sending data out because you know, something was novel or new without thinking about it holistically. But obviously, I think there's safe ways to do it when you're using trusted vendors and you're vetting them appropriately. But you know, I'm sure Heng has a lot of insight on it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that now with the digitization of a lot of things, and this is where the industry's at, right? You look at distributed energy resources with things like virtual power plants. You've got sensors in the home. You've got all of that information streaming up into potentially a cloud service, which is a virtual power plant, which is then orchestrating all those assets on behalf of a microgrid, right? So when you start looking at that particular concept, you essentially have to utilize different third parties, or your supply chain is distributed in that way, which means that I guess you know, understanding how that third party operates and manages your information and your data becomes really important. Having the right I guess, validation and assessment of those third parties, as well as ensuring that the contractual controls are in place in order to protect you from a data breach. And then it's just about partnering with that organization, right? Because they form an extension of your organization, of your brand. It's working with the organization to make sure that they are at least culturally aligned to how you would protect your own data. So I think those are really important pieces to sort of formulate and to have those discussions with and form part of your, I guess, security change process as you bring on these third parties into everything. So yeah, it's definitely one of those things now where yeah, you need to look holistically at the solution and at the third parties which are performing critical functions for your organization.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to thank you both so much for joining us today. Your insights are very appreciated, and I hope they were helpful for the audience as well. We do have a brief survey after the webinar. If you could fill that out and send us your feedback, that would be very much appreciated. So thank you again, Drew and Hang. And please join us next week for our webinar on supply chain security. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. Thank you.